Many people are saying it is hard to imagine living through the next 4 years without Jon Stewart to poke fun at the Trump White House. But Stewart, he's gone, as we know, from The Daily Show, and so are a whole bunch of other people who have become famous as a result of that program. All that and more is detailed in The Daily Show, the book. We sat down with its author, Chris Smith. Honestly, great stuff. I mean, like many, a fan of the show, but so much stuff I had no idea that was in here. But it starts with a reminder as to who Stewart was when he first got the gig and what he was walking into. He was not a white-hot commodity with Stewart, and also, people may forget this, but Craig Kilborn, he was popular at the time, and the show was not a know-nothing show, a very different format than what it became. But you know, Stewart walked into something where he wasn't getting love necessarily from the staff writers, but also he was walking into a show that had its own legs.
Quite right. Yeah, I mean, it's ancient history now, the way the world moves. But yeah, Craig Kilborn was getting some traction from 96 through 98. He got a huge, terrific offer to go to CBS to follow David Letterman. And Jon Stewart had kicked around. I mean, I first wrote about him, to really date myself, in 1993 when he had a brief gig hosting a talk show on MTV. And he'd done some small roles in romantic comedies. He'd had a pretty successful stand-up club career. But the stakes were high for him in joining The Daily Show when he did in January 1999. What was interesting to go back and be reminded in talking to Jon and talking to other people at the show was that he didn't come into The Daily Show with a blueprint master plan. He had an idea that he wanted to make the show more relevant to the things he was interested in, more relevant to national news. Jon's crucial vision or redirection of the show was to punch up, to, you know, go after people in power, in politics, in the media. And that, particularly as the 2000 presidential campaign unfolded, was a gift to him in The Daily Show.
And as you detail in the book here, the staffers that were holdovers from the show, because he walked into basically somebody else's house, if you will, did Stewart, they were like, listen, we write it, you read it, stop with the edits here. And as you detail Stewart, he's not only brilliant, but he's obsessive too, but he didn't know how to necessarily handle that in the beginning. But there was an incident that got so ugly that it even ended up on page 6 in the Post. Give a little background to that.
Yeah, well, I mean, Jon inherited 6 writers from the Craig Kilborn staff who had a tremendous amount of autonomy under Kilborn. Kilborn came in, read the jokes, essentially, you know, said the words that were in the prompter. Jon's a talented writer who had a very distinct vision of the direction he wanted the show to go in. So he started rewriting their work. And, you know, it's like a football team changes head coaches. You know, the general manager and the other staff, often there's a lot of friction. They sat Jon down and read him the riot act in the early days of the show. You know, this is our show. We're in charge here. And Jon pushed back hard in, you know, language on a family channel here that we can't repeat. But he essentially waited them out. You know, he took the show in the direction he wanted to go day in, day out. He made some crucial hires, a head writer named Ben Carlin, who had essentially created The Onion while he was in college, and then later went on to executive produce the show Modern Family. Ben and a guy named David Javerbaum became the new voices that Jon wanted, and he waited out the old writers. Their contracts expired. He turned over the show staff, except for a handful of folks, and quickly took control. You know, he also brought in talent with the help of the executive producer, people like Stephen Colbert, who he inherited, Steve Carell, who came in the early days. You know, Samantha Bee was a crucial early hire by Jon. So that changed the personality and the voice of the show pretty quickly.
There's a lot of moments people can talk to as turning moments. I just remember on the campaign trail with Obama and McCain, 8 years ago, where and McCain, and you talk to him in the book here, he and his wife, Cindy, they have fond remembrances of these guys. They almost threw him a bone because they weren't getting the access like regular press would. They brought him on the bus, and I think it was Carell, right, who asked all of a sudden a real serious policy question, and you could see McCain looking at him like, what just happened here? And he says, no, I'm just kidding, and I forget where he went with it, but that was the moment where, where's that line with satire and really policy? You saw the beginnings there.
You're right on target, and some of the blow by blow that hadn't been reported before, I thought was interesting and funny. That was a turning point in the show, in the tone, in the ability to get access to powerful politicians. And you're right, as you describe it, Carell asks a series of really softball questions, what kind of tree would you be, that kind of thing. And McCain has a real sense of humor and is playing along. And then Carell asks him, Senator, you paint yourself as a strong opponent of pork barrel spending, yet when you were head of the Commerce Committee, you approved, far more pork barrel appropriations than any chairman in history. And McCain freezes. There's a deer in the headlights moment, which Carell punctures, by saying he doesn't even know what those words mean. Now, that was funny, plenty funny on its own. What was funny to me was that Carell and the producer of that piece, a guy named Nick McKinney, found that question, the pork barrel question, as they were driving over to the shoot in Time magazine and said, okay, ask him this. And what became, a pivotal moment in the history of the show was not improvised, but very much seat of the pants. And what's interesting, and not to sound too pretentious about it, that was their starting point with McCain. And the McCain Daily Show trajectory really tracks where they were sort of playful, friendly, and then it gets a little more tense and a little more hostile to the point where in 2008, McCain refuses to come on the show, and John and the staff create a puppet John McCain to be interviewed instead of the real John McCain. And there was, a lot of goofy humor behind that, but the turning point was an interview Jon Stewart and John McCain had about the conduct of the Iraq War. And that was, the kind of thing, that digging into that kind of substance, whether in interviews, whether in field pieces, with the overlay of comedy, is what separated The Daily Show from the pack.
Chris, and that brings me to what I always had, not an issue with the show, but it seemed to me that Stewart always wanted it both ways, where he wanted to be taken seriously as a journalist, and he was one of the best ones going, and with really not just provocative, informed interviews, but also sometimes emotional ones, certainly after 9/11, what he did. But then anytime anybody would press him and push some questions, he would say, time out, I'm followed by a puppet show on Comedy Central here. This is satire, it's not really TV. And I remember when he went on Crossfire, on their set, and he ripped a new one into Bagala as well as Tucker Carlson. And again, for me, I was like, well, which one is it? You kind of want to straddle it both ways depending on, how you want to be treated. Did he acknowledge that sometimes it was a tough line to navigate?
Oh, certainly. And he, got beaten up from time to time, particularly in the wake of that Crossfire thing. Carlson would say, oh, you try to escape this by saying, I'm just a comedian. I did a tremendous amount of research. I'm never going to, claim I've read every utterance of John's for the past 25 years, but I'm close to it. He never said, I'm just a comedian. In fact, he said, yes, we're on Comedy Central. We have a lead-in, that's puppets making crank phone calls, but we take total responsibility for the facts and the substance in our material. Yeah, he felt relative to full-time journalists, CNN, MSNBC, Fox, his responsibility was different than folks who were on 24/7 covering the news. But, no, straight up, he's never said, I'm just a comedian, and he felt that, what he was doing was satire, and the audience was sophisticated enough generally to understand that.
And up next, is there life after Jon Stewart? What was the Daily Show before he actually came on board? More of our interview with Smith straight ahead.